Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. Just can't help saying that Chaudhry Hashmat, actually, how come he didn't know who could have actually moved the dam? He didn't reach out to the right people in this country. I'm no climate expert. I'm not a finance chap either. I'm just a judge, and I just share my perspective on climate justice as a judge, as how judiciary would look at it. And my emphasis post-Baku, the judicial approach has changed. And I'll talk about that as to what the future line of action of climate justice would be in this country. And I'll also say that how actually climate justice or the decisions we've given have didn't really make any difference on the ground. There's a huge gap. There's a very robust and rich jurisprudence, but the ground reality is very different, very stark and very depressing. So there is a huge gap, and I think I'll just try to identify why that gap is there. Other than the political will, there's another factor. So the entire emphasis of what I'm going to say today is that, to me, climate justice or climate finance is the new climate justice, actually, and I'll come to that in just a while. So don't have any qualms about the fact that climate change is here for real, I mean, excluding Trump. Climate change is here for real, and it is the greatest existential challenge for our generation. Climate emergency underscores the urgent need for immediate action to face and fight climate change with even greater courage, intelligence, and creativity, and confront and combat escalating impacts of climate change. In Global South, including Pakistan, we see year after year the impacts of climate change are getting more intense. Every year, hundreds of millions of people endure increasingly extreme weather events, taking away precious livelihoods and lives, from posing issues such as intense droughts, water scarcity, severe fires, rising sea levels to flooding, melting of glaciers, catastrophic storms, and declining biodiversity. Pakistan makes a tiny contribution to total global greenhouse gases emissions, but it is amongst the countries most vulnerable to climate change, and it is the 8th most affected country due to climate change in the world. For Pakistan, the more immediate and pressing task is to prepare itself for adaptation to climate change and to attend to the loss and damage caused by the climate change, while simultaneously addressing other true planetary crises, the loss of biodiversity and the challenge of pollution and waste that we just heard about. I wish to underline that in the environmental cases of 1990s, courts, and why I talk about judiciary, because I think judiciary did take a lead on environmental movement in this country, and we have one of the leaders sitting right here, Dr. Parvez Hassan, and you can't forget Shaila Zia. These were our main iconic cases that moved the agenda. The Constitutional Court actually moved the environmental movement in this country. The executive didn't do much about it. I think it all came from the judiciary initially, and then sort of translated into climate justice, which I'll just explain in a while, how we moved on from environmental justice onto climate justice. I wish to underline that in the environmental cases of the 1990s, courts primarily focused on penalizing industries or polluters and directed governments to implement policy changes aimed at improving the environment. However, the critical aspect of finance, or more specifically nature finance, was never part of the discussion. And this is, in retrospect, I'm highlighting. The entire environmental justice movement that we had, where the polluter was in the country, scores of jurisprudential cases that have come out of Supreme Court and High Court, we never talked about who is going to implement those directions. How will they implement those directions? Other than the government or the political will, was there any finance with the government to deal with those issues? We never talked about finance, and that is something that's lacking. Today, it has become increasingly clear that without adequate financing, advancing the environmental agenda is simply not feasible. This realization has brought nature finance to the forefront of discussions, emphasizing that sustainable progress in environmental protection and climate action requires a robust financial backing. Nature finance is now recognized as a cornerstone for achieving environmental and climate goals, highlighting a critical shift in our approach to addressing these challenges. But more of this in a bit. As opposed to environmental justice, which circled around polluter, climate justice unveiled an entirely new and complex canvas for us at the courts. The challenge lies in addressing the broader and more severe macro effects of climate change, such as extreme weather events that disrupt agriculture, health, food security, urban planning, building regulations, industrial licensing, technology, human resources, human displacement, climate-induced trafficking, disaster preparedness, and public health systems. Climate justice emerges as a broader and more nuanced framework than traditional environmental justice, especially for the global south. While environmental justice primarily focused on the equitable distribution of environmental benefits and burdens, climate justice encompasses health security, food security, energy security, water security, human displacement, human trafficking, and disaster management, recognize the intricate interplay between these sectors. So a judge in Pakistan who is looking at climate justice is looking at a whole different world than a judge sitting in the north looking at climate justice, because he's just looking at mitigation, which is a very linear way of looking at climate justice. But I think the scope of adjudication in Pakistan changes when you look at climate justice in the global south. So for the global south, climate justice introduced a significant shift in jurisprudence. It demanded a more sophisticated and inclusive approach to adjudication, one that accounts for multidimensional impacts of climate change across multiple sectors. This necessitates remedies that go beyond retributive measures against polluters and instead adopts restorative and rehabilitative approaches. Courts are now required to design adaptive remedies to protect the rights and dignities of communities disproportionately affected by climate change. So we have to come up with how to come up with a more resilient urban planning, how to come up with a more resilient agricultural planning, climate resilient irrigation plans. This is something that we need to look at. We have a case that comes before us, does not talk about climate change. It might talk about irrigation and water scarcity, but actually you're looking at a climate change issue. There was a case that came to us that said that we want to expand the cement plant in Kalar Kahar, the DG cement case. There was nobody argued climate change in that case. They said we just want to add on, expand the cement plant in Kalar Kahar. And we said no, Kalar Kahar is a water scarce area, and we did not allow that expansion. But hidden in that entire case was the whole concept of climate change, because it's a water scarce country. So this evolution of adaptive climate justice or adaptive jurisprudence, which just belongs to Pakistan or the global south, unlike the north, marks a pivotal moment in the legal landscape where the scope of justice is expanded to address interconnected challenges that were previously outside the purview of environmental law. We now suggest climate resilient urban planning, agriculture, irrigation, farming practices, etc. So the scope increases. If we examine the climate jurisprudence, we see that it has been largely directional. So what have we done in the last maybe 5-7 years? Coming up with very interesting jurisprudence which has been globally quoted now, especially Asghar Laghari case and some of the others. People talk about it internationally. But what has happened in Pakistan? Has anything changed as far as climate justice is concerned? No, I would imagine. Because all we did was we gave directions. Please do fix this. Please go do fix this. Come up with a new plan to do this. But never figured out whether at all the government had political will, that's the side. Did they ever have the money to do this? Or did they have the budget to do this? We never talked about it. Somehow the government never raised this question before us either. So while the courts kept on directing in Asghar Laghari, DG Cement, and a number of other score of cases that we'll do this, CDA was directed to come up with a design which is climate resilient. All buildings in Islamabad should be urban climate resilient. But nothing really happened. The directions are there, they've been quoted all over the world. The jurisprudence is very robust and exciting, but nothing happens on the ground. So debate and discussion at the recent COP29 at Baku brought a fresh perspective of what is really not happening. To address these challenges, to achieve meaningful adaptation or to succeed in a claim for loss and damage caused due to climate change, climate finance becomes an indispensable lifeline. So climate change may be global, but the solutions are not shared equally. Those with resources hoard them, leaving the most vulnerable to perish, said Greta Thunberg. So for a country like Pakistan, which is highly vulnerable to climate change, the availability of robust financial resources is critical for building resilience and protecting its people. Climate finance supports adaptive measures like food defenses, flood defenses, drought-resistant crops, sustainable urban infrastructure, and community-based disaster response systems. Climate finance ensures that individuals can live lives marked by dignity and security, with access to basic needs such as clean water, safe shelter, reliable food supplies. So in essence, climate finance is not just an economic necessity, it is a moral imperative. It ensures that the most vulnerable, who have contributed the least to global emissions, have the resources to adapt, survive and thrive in the changing world. For Pakistan, climate finance is not merely a tool for policy